Could you tell us a little bit about your time in India, in Hyderabad, when you were working as a plant physiologist? How was that time for you?
Well, when I was working in Cambridge on plant development, I came to the conclusion that we simply can't understand the form of plants, how they grow, just on the basis of chemicals and DNA and genes, that something more was needed. And I took up a concept that was already established in biology, morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. This made a lot of sense, but then the question is, how are they inherited? And I came up with this unconventional, controversial theory of inheritance by morphic resonance, a kind of collective memory on which each member of a species draws and to which it contributes. I came up with that idea in Cambridge. It didn't really fit with the kind of standard mechanistic thinking of my colleagues and the atmosphere there. And I realized this was a radical break with what I'd done before, so I wanted time to think about it. And I also wanted to do something useful, and I also loved India because I'd traveled there before. So I took a job at an international agricultural institute in Hyderabad, India, where I was doing practical work on improvement of pigeon peas and chickpeas, which are big crops there. So I was living in India. I was doing practical work in the field, working in villages some of the time, outdoor experiments, and thinking about morphic resonance. I mean, that's what I did in my spare time. So I had a very interesting experience in doing all those things, because the idea of causation across time, a kind of memory to which we tune in, is unfamiliar in the West, except perhaps through Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. But in India, it's completely standard. And so what was shockingly, outrageously radical in Cambridge, when I discussed it with my Indian colleagues, including scientific colleagues, didn't seem to them radical at all. They said things like, we've known that all along. You know, what's so big and what's so new in this idea? You know, this is nothing but karma, the idea of the influence across lives and across generations and so on. The difficulty I had in India was getting them to see that this is something that could be treated scientifically and where you could do experiments, because they thought of it as a philosophical belief system.
Okay, wow. That's a really beautiful insight into those very, very particular differences. Could I take you back one step? Because you said that you came up with this radical idea while you were in Cambridge. What were your influences? Did this just come to you?
Well, I think for me, I was thinking a lot about how plants grow, how form develops, why leaves are leaves and not petals, and why oak trees look different from pines, and so on. And genes alone don't explain it. They just give you the right chemicals, the right enzymes, the right proteins. They don't explain shape. So I was wrestling with this idea of morphogenetic fields and wrestling with the idea of how they can be inherited, and they're not inherited through the genes, so there must be some other way. And what for me was a huge breakthrough was reading a book called Matter and Memory by a French philosopher called Henri Bergson. The book was written in the late 19th century, first translated into English in 1911. And Bergson argues that memory is not stored in the brain. The brain's a receiver of memory, but not a store of memory. And that there's another kind of causation in nature, a causation across time, involved with memory. He was originally just thinking about human memory, not nature in general. But I realized that this idea of a memory principle that could exist different from our normal forms of causation could be the key to understanding a great many things in biology. And that set me off thinking. I had 4 or 5 days of kind of almost manic excitement as this idea worked through my mind, and I began to see the implications and stuff. So that was really, there was a period of sort of almost altered state of consciousness as I thought of a completely new way of seeing a lot of biological phenomena and psychological phenomena.
And do you know much about the gentleman who wrote the book and how that was received when he did? I mean, has this always been very much outside of the scientific realm, or was there a more sympathetic time in our history?
Well, in the late 19th century, there was, I think, a greater openness to holistic thinking. There was a big controversy. Within biology, there was a controversy between vitalism and mechanism. The vitalists were saying there's something more about living organisms that's not just molecular machinery. And there were philosophers who were thinking in a more holistic way. Bergson was one of them. And there were psychologists who were trying to give a broad view of the human mind. One of them was William James in the United States. He was much influenced by Bergson. I would say that there was also a big interest among intellectuals and scientists in psychical research, telepathy, survival of bodily death. These were more mainstream then than they were later. The First World War really was a kind of cut-off for that line of speculation. In the 1920s and 30s, scientific thinking became much more rigidly mechanistic. The debate was much narrower, and the more dogmatic kind of materialistic thinking we're used to became entrenched as an orthodoxy.
When I think of the mechanistic view that Descartes came about with, for example, when he was dissecting animals and saying, don't worry, it's just the squeakings of a machine when they were crying with pain. To the average person in the street, that seems ridiculous, and there is a holistic perspective as well as a reductionist perspective. But the scientific community seems to have just narrowed in. Would you say that they're representative of all of us in the West, or just a small group?
Well, I think they're representative of the mainstream of education, culture, government and business, because the scientific mechanistic way of thinking has become the default position of educated people, not just in the West, but in the East too. I mean, in China and India, educated Chinese and Indians are interested in the same kind of mechanistic way of thinking as the way their business and government and scientific enterprises run. And I think what's happened is that there's been a split. It goes back much further in the West, but we've created in other cultures too, between mechanistic thinking, which operates from 9 to 5 on Mondays to Fridays for most people, and then a different, more private way of experiencing nature. That's why the great cities of the Western world are clogged with traffic on Friday afternoons, as millions of people try to get back to nature in a car. There's this sense that our true selves are much more connected with nature, which is why lots of people want country cottages if they get rich, and like the idea that there's a part of themselves which is connected with nature. And that goes back much further in the West. I mean, at the end of the 18th century, when mechanistic thinking, Enlightenment rationalism, was becoming the standard intellectual mindset of educated people, science and reason, in this rather mechanistic way. There was, after all, the great Romantic movement. The Romantic poets led a kind of back to nature movement. And I think what we've had since then is a kind of cultural split where during working hours we're prepared to go along with mechanistic thinking. In our free time we think differently. And most people in our culture have that split too. Most people, if they keep a dog or a cat, know that it's not a machine. They know it's a being with feelings and thoughts and emotions and bonds with them, often telepathic. Lots of people know that, but they won't mention it at work. And lots of people who keep dogs and cats, who know that these animals have thoughts and feelings, are perfectly happy shopping in supermarkets, buying battery chicken meat that's been grown in battery chicken farms, which are based on the mechanistic principle that animals are nothing but machines. They're part of a production line for industrial farming, for factory farming. So people would be perfectly happy doing that, and as soon as they get home think quite differently about their dog or cat. So it's a completely split mentality. If you take seriously that your knowledge that dogs and cats and other animals are true living beings with feelings, and you take seriously your liking for plants, because gardening is one of the most popular of all hobbies, and even people who don't garden have house plants. So these are enormously big parts of people's lives, plants and animals. But if you take those seriously, then you would challenge factory farming and industrial agriculture, or you might become a vegetarian or an animal rights activist. So by keeping this split in our culture, it's business as usual in the government, academic, environment world, the business world. And people's feelings and the more spiritual side of their being is privatized into their private lives and kept strictly separate from the public domain. We've now created the split in other cultures. We've exported Western scientific materialism, so it's the dominant ethos of the ruling classes in Africa, Asia, South America, everywhere. But when they're off duty, in India, most Indians go back to being traditional Hindus or Muslims or Jains or whatever they are. And when Japanese are off duty, a lot of them appreciate haikus and cherry blossom and so forth. So I think this split, we've got so used to it, it's hard to see that we live this very split life.
I totally agree. It's beautiful the way you describe it. I think that I am very much a victim of that myself. I was not an intellectual at school. I wanted to side with the people who were the rationalists, the people who were doing well at school. I wanted to be in that group. And so when it has come about in my recent history that I've had these extraordinary experiences that have challenged my rational perspective of life, maybe I haven't yet fully had the courage to let go of some of those mechanistic views because I don't want to be seen as stupid, because I'm still perhaps a little bit insecure in my intellect. And do you think that that's quite common in our world, that people like myself are struggling with this bipolar perspective?
Oh, yes. I think it's very common. I mean, we all experience it. I mean, I had the same experiences too, that everybody in our culture, I think, is torn between this kind of rationalist, scientific, materialist worldview and the more private feelings we have, our more private experiences. And I think it's the basis of our whole civilization as it's now constituted. So I don't think it's unique to you at all.
No. What are the dangers, you think, in our society of this split?
I think it's very unhealthy to have this split between rational intellect and science and feelings, emotion and experience, which everybody has to some degree. And it comes from a particular scientific view. It's not as if science has to be split off from experience like that. But we have a kind of science at the moment based on a materialist philosophy that says the only reality is matter. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. It's all inside the head. And basically consciousness doesn't really exist. It's a kind of illusion produced by the computing machinery of the brain. So this enormously downgrades consciousness, treats it as an illusion, as something that's just subjective, unscientific and therefore irrational, and completely dismisses all the things that are most important to us. I mean, value, meaning, beauty, purpose, love. I mean, those are nothing but chemical balances or electrical patterns in the brain, or sort of impulses crossing synapses, or waves of electrical activity in the cerebral cortex or the lower brain. These are tremendously demystifying ways of looking at the world, and even the most hard-headed materialist doesn't really believe that. I mean, they don't really believe like that when they get home from the lab. But, I mean, if they did, they'd have very dysfunctional relationships with their partners, their children and their animals. So they revert to being ordinary people once they get home, or at least the majority do. So I think it's a terribly unhealthy philosophy. And I don't think it's necessary for science either. I think it's in fact become a straitjacket, a constriction on science itself. The whole point of my recent book, The Science Delusion, is that science has become imprisoned within a materialistic dogmatism that's restricting what science itself can do, restricting the freedom of inquiry, and producing a highly distorted view of the world. It's very good for building machines. If you take the assumption that everything's mechanistic, it gives you a wonderful philosophy for machinery and for the Industrial Revolution and from computers and smartphones and internet and jet planes, all tremendously impressive. But it gives you a very bad way of understanding the natural world, the nature of life, the nature of mind, of consciousness, of human society, of culture, of myth, of story, of religion, of spiritual experience. Those are simply airbrushed out of the picture by this worldview, reduced to mere activity of material brains. So I think it's a very unhealthy philosophy, not just for society, not just for individuals, but for science itself.
And why is it? Why has it come about like that? Is it just because if it can't be measured, it can't be true? Is that what science has become? Is it?
I think it's more than just that. It's partly if it can't be measured, it can't be true. But it's basically an ideology that's developed. The history, very briefly, is that in the 17th century there was a split, the Descartes split, the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Descartes defined matter as unconscious and minds as conscious but non-material. So the only non-material things in the universe were God, angels, and human minds. The whole of the rest of the universe was unconscious matter. The human body was unconscious matter, a machine. The human mind, unlike animal minds, or animals didn't have minds, unlike anything else in nature, was immaterial and spiritual. This gave a split between science and religion, and it enabled science to get on with studying the universe, and religion to remain in a separate compartment. Descartes himself was quite religious, all the founding fathers of modern science were. But it created this completely disconnected mind. And it worked reasonably well till the 19th century, and a lot of people then got very upset about there being two things. They said, we just want one thing, not two things, not dualism. And so some became idealists and said the only reality is mind or consciousness. Matter is kind of dumbed-down mind that's trapped in patterns of habit. The other lot, the materialists, said this so-called immaterial mind doesn't exist. Angels and God, forget it, they're just illusions, they don't exist at all. And the human mind isn't something special, it's just the activity of the brain, it's nothing but the brain. So materialism was a denial of the spiritual or mental pole of dualism. And dualism itself was, I think, a very foreshortened, false kind of philosophy of nature, oversimplified philosophy of nature. But it served the purposes of science in the 17th and 18th century, and it kept science and religion out of each other's hair most of the time, and enabled people to go on being religious and go on being scientific. It provided a way of them living together fairly harmoniously. So it served a useful purpose. But in the end, it's very unsatisfactory. So I think I'm not in favour of materialism or idealism or dualism. I think that the basic model of reality we need is Trinitarian. We need at least three basic principles, not two or one. But that's just another discussion. I mean, it's a whole metaphysical question. Sure. But the reason materialism came in was through denying dualism. And it arose for ideological reasons, and it was then backed with the authority of the Enlightenment project of science and reason. And science is so successful in giving technologies, most people think it must be true. What could possibly be wrong with this theory of nature? It works. But it's created all these terrible problems we now face today. The way forward, I think, is by realizing that materialism is an ideology that science is actually already outgrowing, actually in many ways has outgrown.